The long-term health consequences of ultra-processed diets are increasingly well documented and deeply alarming. Longitudinal studies consistently show that early exposure to these highly engineered, calorie-dense, nutrient-poor foods is a powerful predictor of adult obesity, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, and a host of related chronic conditions. What makes the issue particularly insidious is that the damage accumulates quietly over years or decades. For many individuals, symptoms do not emerge until adulthood, by which point the physiological changes are entrenched and difficult to reverse. Ultra-processed foods are not merely a dietary inconvenience, they are a slow-acting but relentless driver of systemic dysfunction. Research indicates that children and adolescents who regularly consume ultra-processed foods, sugary drinks, snack foods, packaged meals, and fast foods, begin to develop early metabolic impairments long before overt obesity is visible. High sugar intake contributes to repeated insulin spikes, which over time reduce insulin sensitivity and set the stage for prediabetes. Refined carbohydrates and processed fats exacerbate this by promoting visceral fat accumulation, which is metabolically active and drives chronic inflammation. These effects compound over time, creating a foundation for metabolic syndrome in early adulthood. Longitudinal cohort studies, such as the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children and the Nutrinet Santé cohort, demonstrate that individuals with the highest consumption of ultra-processed foods in childhood and adolescence have significantly higher body mass index, BMI, greater waist circumference, and increased prevalence of metabolic syndrome in adulthood, even after adjusting for physical activity and socioeconomic status. The cardiovascular consequences are equally troubling. Early and persistent exposure to processed foods contributes to dyslipidemia, elevated triglycerides, and the gradual buildup of arterial plaque. Diets high in sodium, hydrogenated fats, and refined sugars accelerate hypertension and impair endothelial function. Over decades, these cumulative insults increase the likelihood of atherosclerosis, heart attacks, strokes, and heart failure. Long-term studies, such as those published in the BMJ and Journal of the American College of Cardiology, show that adults with consistently high intake of ultra-processed foods from adolescence through adulthood have a markedly higher risk of cardiovascular mortality. What is striking is that these effects are not merely a reflection of obesity. They occur even in individuals who are not visibly overweight, highlighting that processed foods have intrinsic metabolic and inflammatory toxicity that goes beyond caloric content. Obesity itself, while visible, is just one manifestation of deeper physiological disruption. The combination of hyperpalatable processed foods and early life exposure leads to persistent alterations in appetite regulation, hormonal signaling, and reward pathways in the brain. Leptin resistance reduces the brain's ability to sense satiety, ghrelin dysregulation increases hunger, and repeated dopamine surges from sugary, salty, and fatty foods reinforce compulsive eating behaviors. Over years, these changes make it extremely difficult to maintain a balanced diet, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that accelerates weight gain, insulin resistance, and metabolic deterioration. By the time adults attempt to adopt healthier diets, their systems are already adapted to high-calorie, low-nutrient foods, making reversal slow and incomplete in many cases. Beyond metabolic and cardiovascular consequences, ultra-processed diets also exacerbate inflammation and oxidative stress, which are underlying drivers of numerous chronic conditions. Chronic low-grade inflammation, triggered by additives, emulsifiers, refined sugars, and industrial fats, damages blood vessels, liver function, and even cognitive health. Longitudinal evidence suggests that early and sustained consumption of ultra-processed foods is associated with higher markers of systemic inflammation, which in turn accelerates the progression of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and age-related cognitive decline. Essentially, the body experiences a cumulative burden. The longer processed foods dominate the diet, the more entrenched the inflammatory and metabolic dysfunction becomes, and the harder it is to recover. The societal implications of these findings are severe. Populations with high availability and affordability of ultra-processed foods, particularly children in low-income communities, are disproportionately exposed to these risks. The cumulative damage begins early and continues silently into adulthood, contributing to the global rise in obesity, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and cardiovascular mortality. Individual awareness alone is insufficient. The structural, economic, and cultural forces promoting processed food consumption create environments where harm is not only likely but almost inevitable without intervention. The warning from longitudinal research is stark. Early and sustained consumption of ultra-processed foods lays the groundwork for a lifetime of metabolic dysfunction, obesity, and cardiovascular disease. These are not short-term or reversible harms. They represent decades of cumulative physiological insult that accelerate biological aging and increase the risk of premature morbidity and mortality. Ultra-processed diets are not merely unhealthy. They are a slow-acting, systemic hazard whose effects unfold quietly yet relentlessly, leaving adults to confront a range of chronic diseases that might have been largely preventable with healthier dietary patterns from the earliest years.